Billionaire found a waitress. Crying at her son's grave, what happened next shocked everyone. She had everything money could buy: power, influence, and an empire that made her one of the richest women in the country. But no amount of wealth could bring back the one thing she had lost forever: her son. Every week she visited his grave, standing silently among the marble stones, her designer heels sinking into the soft grass, her heart heavy with grief. For years, this had been her private ritual, a place where she allowed herself to be vulnerable, far from the eyes of boardrooms and cameras. But one ordinary afternoon, everything changed. As she approached the familiar headstone, her eyes caught something unusual. A woman, dressed in a simple faded waitress uniform, was kneeling just a few steps away. Her shoulders trembled, her head bowed as silent sobs shook her fragile frame. Beside her stood a young child, no older than 7 or 8, holding her hand tightly while staring at the ground with wide, confused eyes. The woman's skin was dark, her apron stained from a long day's work, and her voice broke as she whispered words only the wind could hear. At first, the billionaire was annoyed. This was her place, her grief. Why would someone else choose to collapse in tears here in front of her son's grave? But as she drew closer, something inside her shifted. The sight of that child clinging to his mother, the sound of those muffled cries, it wasn't just sadness, it was desperation. It was pain so raw it cut deeper than words. Questions raced through her mind. Who was this woman? Why here? And what connection could she possibly have to her son's resting place? The billionaire felt a chill run down her spine. She had come to grieve her loss, but instead she had stumbled into someone else's hidden story, one that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her son, about herself, and about the walls that divide people in ways money and power could never erase. Because sometimes the truth doesn't come in boardrooms or bank accounts. It comes when you least expect it, whispered through tears on sacred ground. And what she was about to discover would shake her to her very core. The world knew her as Eleanor Whitmore, the billionaire businesswoman, the iron-willed CEO who had built a global empire from the ashes of her husband's failing company. To outsiders, she was untouchable, the kind of woman who appeared in glossy magazines, her face framed by luxury and power. Yet behind the glass walls of her towering penthouse, she was still just a mother whose heart had been broken beyond repair. Her son Daniel had been her pride and joy. He was young, brilliant, and full of life, taken too soon in a tragic accident that not even her billions could prevent. In the years since his death, Eleanor had created routines to mask the hollow ache in her chest. She went to board meetings, hosted charity events, and smiled for cameras, but every week without fail, she drove herself to the cemetery at the edge of town. It was the only place where she shed her armor. Standing by her son's grave, she whispered updates about her life, as if he could still hear her. She told him about the latest deals, about the weather, even about the emptiness of her penthouse. She never expected answers, but in that quiet space she could pretend he was still near. This was supposed to be her private world, her sacred refuge. That day had begun like so many others. The chauffeur dropped her at the cemetery gates, though she insisted on walking the last stretch alone. She preferred the silence, the crunch of gravel beneath her heels, the rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe she was just another grieving mother, not a woman defined by wealth and expectation. But as she rounded the familiar path, her gaze caught an unfamiliar sight. A figure knelt near her son's headstone. It was a woman. Her clothes were plain, her apron still tied around her waist, creased, stained, the kind of uniform worn by someone who spent long hours serving tables. Her skin glistened with tears as her shoulders shook, and beside her stood a boy, perhaps 7 years old, clutching a worn backpack and gripping his mother's trembling hand. Eleanor stopped in her tracks, her chest tightening. This was not supposed to happen. Her son's grave was always quiet, untouched by strangers. Who were they? Why here? At first, frustration sparked inside her. This was her time, her place of mourning. She had built walls around her grief, and now those walls were being intruded upon. But when she looked closer, really looked, something about the scene unsettled her. The boy's eyes lingered on the gravestone, wide and searching, as if he knew more than his silence betrayed. The woman's lips trembled as she murmured words Eleanor couldn't quite hear. But it wasn't the kind of grief Eleanor knew. It wasn't the distant, polished grief of anniversaries or rituals. It was raw, unfiltered, the kind that came from a wound still bleeding. And then, a thought she couldn't explain gripped her. Why this grave? Why her son's grave? Eleanor's chest rose and fell, her heartbeat quickening. Her instinct told her to walk away, to give this stranger space. Yet another voice whispered, what if there was more to this? What if this wasn't just a coincidence? Her empire had taught her to see patterns, to follow hunches. And something about this moment felt different, significant, as if fate itself had placed her here at this precise time. For years, Eleanor believed she had carried her grief alone. But now, for the first time, she wondered if there were secrets tied to her son's life and his death that she had never been told. She drew in a breath, her eyes fixed on the waitress and her child. She didn't know it yet, but this chance encounter at her son's grave was not an intrusion. It was the beginning of a story that would tear open the past, force her to confront truths she had long ignored, and bind her life to theirs in ways she could never have imagined. Because sometimes, the people we overlook carry the very keys to the answers we've been searching for all along. Eleanor stood frozen at the edge of the path, her designer handbag resting lightly against her wrist, though it suddenly felt unbearably heavy. The sight before her gnawed at something inside, a quiet unease she couldn't brush away. The waitress and the child, why did they look so out of place here at this grave? The boy fidgeted with the straps of his backpack, his dark curls falling into his eyes as he glanced around nervously. His small voice broke the silence. Mama, do you think he hears us? The mother's face crumpled as she squeezed his hand tighter. He always hears us, she whispered, her words almost carried away by the wind. Eleanor's breath caught. Who was he? Surely not Daniel, but the way the boy's gaze lingered on the headstone, it felt too intentional, too pointed. She stepped forward slowly, her heels crunching against the gravel. The woman startled, quickly brushing her tears away as though ashamed of her sorrow, while the child ducked half behind her apron. Their eyes darted to Eleanor, filled with the nervous wariness of people used to being dismissed, or worse, judged. I'm sorry, the woman stammered. We didn't mean to intrude. Her voice was rough, cracked from crying. Eleanor opened her mouth, but no words came. She had faced prime ministers, battled cutthroat investors, and commanded thousands of employees without faltering. Yet in front of this trembling waitress, she felt strangely powerless. It's my son's grave, Eleanor managed at last, her tone firmer than she intended. The woman nodded, lowering her head. I know. The words struck Eleanor like ice water. I know. Her pulse quickened. How could this stranger possibly know? The woman's lips trembled as though holding back something she dared not speak. The boy clung tighter to her side, his wide eyes shimmering with unspoken fear. Something deep within Eleanor shifted. The instinct that had made her billions, the ability to sense when a story wasn't complete, flared alive. She knew without question that this was no coincidence. But before she could press further, the woman rose quickly, tugging her child toward the exit. Come, baby, we should go. Eleanor's sharp voice cut through the air. Wait! The woman froze, her back stiff. She didn't turn around, but her son did. His gaze locked with Eleanor's, and in that moment she felt as though she were staring into something familiar, something that belonged not to a stranger, but to her past. Her heart pounded. As the pair hurried down the path, Eleanor's mind spun. Why had the woman said, I know? Why had the boy looked at Daniel's grave with such painful familiarity? And why did she feel as though their presence wasn't just chance, but destiny pulling threads she hadn't noticed until now? That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She replayed the scene again and again. The waitress's trembling hands, the boy's question, the haunting sadness etched across their faces. She couldn't let it go. She didn't want to let it go. So she began to dig. Her assistant pulled up employee records. The uniform had been from a modest diner across town, a place Eleanor would never have set foot in, but a place where countless working-class families passed their days unseen. The waitress's name was Lila Johnson, single mother, few resources, no mention of any connection to Eleanor or her son. And yet, why Daniel's grave? Days turned into restless nights. Eleanor's visits to the cemetery became more frequent, as though waiting, hoping to see them again. And eventually, she did. Lila was there once more, kneeling by the grave with her son, whispering the same quiet prayers. This time, Eleanor approached more gently, her voice low but steady. "I need to understand," she said. The waitress stiffened, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "You don't," she whispered back. "You're better off not knowing." But Eleanor was not a woman who accepted unanswered questions. Not in business, not in life, and certainly not when it came to her son. With every unanswered look, with every whispered prayer, the truth clawed closer. Eleanor could sense it now. This wasn't just grief. It was connection. The kind of connection that could only come from a bond tied in life or in secrets long buried. And as Eleanor watched the child's small hand trace the letters on her son's grave, she felt her world teetering on the edge of revelation. Because sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it rises with a force so undeniable it shatters the walls you've built around your heart. And Eleanor was about to learn that her son's story wasn't finished. Not yet. The autumn wind howled through the cemetery as Eleanor stood facing Lila, the waitress who had unsettled her world. For weeks, Eleanor had chased shadows, phone calls, inquiries, restless nights replaying the same questions. But no amount of research could explain what she felt every time she saw that child kneel at her son's grave. And now, here they were again. Lila's son clung to her hand, his dark curls blowing across his forehead, his wide eyes darting between the two women. The silence was suffocating until Eleanor finally broke it, her voice trembling yet firm. "Why do you come here?" Lila's lips parted, then pressed shut again. Her shoulders shook as she wiped at her face. "You wouldn't understand," she whispered. "Make me," Eleanor demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "This is my son's grave, and every time I see you here, I know there's something you're not telling me. Tell me the truth." Lila's chest rose and fell, her breath ragged. For a long moment, she seemed ready to walk away. But then, she looked down at her son, and something in her broke. "You want the truth?" she said, her voice cracking. "Your son, your Daniel. He wasn't the man you think he was." The words hit Eleanor like a slap. She staggered back, her perfectly polished nails digging into her palm. "What are you talking about?" Lila's eyes glistened as she spoke, her voice heavy with years of silence. "He was kind. He came into the diner where I worked. He saw me when no one else did. When I was invisible to the world, he treated me like a person. He'd sit in my section just to talk. He cared about my son, about our struggles. He even helped me pay rent once when I couldn't." Eleanor's heart twisted. Daniel had never told her any of this. "But more than that," Lila continued, her voice trembling now, "he promised me something. He promised he'd help me get out of this cycle, that he'd make sure my boy had a chance at a better life. He said he'd always be there for us." Her hand tightened on her son's shoulder. "And then, he was gone." The boy's eyes filled with tears as he whispered, "Mama says he was like family." Eleanor's breath hitched. She turned her gaze toward the boy, and in his eyes she saw it. That same spark Daniel used to have when he was a child. That quiet determination. That warmth. It was as though, for one haunting moment, She was staring at a reflection of her own son. The world spun around her. The carefully constructed image she had of Daniel, her brilliant, privileged heir, began to crack. Beneath the suits and the wealth, he had lived a life she hadn't known, a life that touched people far outside the walls of their empire. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lila let out a broken laugh, the kind that carries no joy. "To who? To you? To a world that never saw me as more than a waitress in a dirty apron? No one listens to women like me. And even if they did, what good would it have done? He was gone. My son and I, we were left with nothing but his memory." The weight of it crashed over Eleanor like a tidal wave. She realized, in that moment, just how blind she had been. Not only to Daniel's hidden kindness, but to the quiet struggles of people she had overlooked her entire life. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the grass, clutching the gravestone. "All this time," she whispered through tears. "All this time, and I never knew." The boy stepped forward then, hesitant but brave, and placed his small hand over hers. His touch was warm, grounding. Eleanor looked up into his eyes, and in that innocent gaze, she saw not just her son's legacy, but a chance for redemption. Lila's sobs filled the air as Eleanor's tears mingled with hers, grief and revelation colliding in one unforgettable moment. And for the first time in years, Eleanor wasn't just mourning her son. She was seeing the impact of his life, written not in wealth or power, but in the lives he had quietly touched. What she had discovered shattered her world. But it also gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The air in the cemetery was still heavy with grief, yet something had shifted. Eleanor, the billionaire who had come here to mourn her son alone, now sat on the cold grass surrounded by truths she had never imagined. Across from her, Lila held her little boy close, the both of them trembling as if afraid their secret had just shattered whatever fragile safety they had left. But Eleanor didn't feel anger. Not anymore. Instead, she felt an overwhelming flood of emotions. Grief for her son, guilt for her blindness, but also awe at the hidden goodness in him. Daniel had not been the shallow, privileged heir the tabloids once painted him as. He had lived a life of quiet compassion that Eleanor had never recognized. For the first time in years, her tears didn't fall for herself. They fell for the people her son had touched, the people who had carried his memory in silence. She turned to Lila, her voice softer now, stripped of pride. "All this time you've been carrying this alone, and I never knew. I never even thought to ask." Lila looked away, shame etched across her face. "People like you never see people like me. I was just a waitress serving coffee to men in suits. Daniel was different." He looked past that. Eleanor swallowed hard. She couldn't argue with her. For decades, she had lived in a world walled off from the struggles of ordinary families. Even when tragedy struck her own life, her wealth had cushioned her from its harshest blows. Yet here was a woman who had suffered in silence, holding on to Daniel's memory like a lifeline. The boy shifted closer to Eleanor, his small hand brushing against hers. She looked at him fully now, the spark in his eyes, the stubborn strength in his posture. He reminded her so much of Daniel at that age it made her chest ache. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The boy straightened, as though this was the first time someone important had really asked. "Michael," he said, his voice clear. "Michael," Eleanor repeated, tasting the name on her lips. It felt sacred somehow, like the echo of her son's unfinished promise. For the next few moments, silence enveloped them. The wind carried the sound of leaves rustling, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Finally, Eleanor rose slowly, brushing the damp grass from her knees. She looked at Lila and her son not as strangers, but as pieces of Daniel's hidden legacy. "You shouldn't have to face this world alone," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Lila's brows furrowed, suspicion mixing with disbelief. "What are you saying?" Eleanor's gaze drifted to Daniel's headstone. Her son had tried to bridge two worlds, hers, built on wealth and privilege, and Lila's, marked by struggle and invisibility. He hadn't lived long enough to fulfill that promise, but perhaps, Eleanor thought, she could. "I can't bring him back," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "But I can make sure his promise to you lives on. You said he wanted a better future for Michael. Then that's what I'll give him." Lila's eyes widened, tears streaming again. "Why would you do that? After everything?" "Because," Eleanor said, her voice firm now, "my son saw something in you and your child that I was too blind to see. He left me wealth, but he left you something more precious, his heart, and I won't dishonor that." The boy's small hand found hers again, and this time Eleanor didn't hesitate. She clasped it tightly, feeling warmth she thought she had lost forever. From that day forward, Eleanor's life changed in ways she had never expected. She didn't just offer a check and walk away. That would have been too easy, too hollow. Instead, she opened doors. She ensured Michael had access to the best education, not as charity, but as the fulfillment of a promise. She gave Lila the chance to step out of the shadows, supporting her dreams, not defining her by struggle. But more than that, Eleanor began to listen. To really listen. She started visiting places she had once ignored. The diners, the neighborhoods, where families like Lila's lived. She funded programs not just in Daniel's name, but in honor of the unseen bonds he had built. She used her influence not for appearances, but for impact. And with every step, she carried the memory of that moment in the cemetery. The moment she realized her wealth meant nothing if it couldn't bridge the gap between privilege and humanity. The tabloids eventually caught wind of her unusual new partnership with a former waitress and her son. Some mocked her, some praised her. But Eleanor didn't care. For the first time in years, she didn't live for the headlines. She lived for the promise her son had left behind. And yet the deepest change was not in the world around her, but in herself. She found herself returning to Daniel's grave. But she never went alone anymore. Sometimes Michael would bring a drawing he'd made, proudly showing it to her before placing it by the headstone. Sometimes Lila would stand silently beside her, no longer just a grieving stranger, but something closer to family. Together, they created a new kind of mourning, a mourning that was not just about loss, but about building something meaningful from the ashes. Eleanor often thought back to that first moment she had seen Lila crying by Daniel's grave. She had felt anger then, even intrusion. Now she understood that it had been fate, her son's final gift, guiding her to the truth she needed to face. In the end, Eleanor realized something profound. Money fades, power fades, even grief changes shape with time. But kindness, those quiet, unseen acts that ripple through the lives of others, that is what endures. As the sun set one evening, painting the sky with gold, Eleanor looked at Michael running across the cemetery grass, laughing freely. For a fleeting second, she could almost hear Daniel's laughter echoing in the wind, as though he were saying, "You finally see it, Mom. This was always bigger than me." Eleanor smiled through her tears. She knew she could never undo the years of blindness, but she could choose differently now. And so, the woman who once thought her life was defined by wealth discovered something infinitely greater. The power of compassion, the legacy of unseen promises, and the unshakable truth that love, real love, has no boundaries.